Thanks, Premier. As you've heard, the situation in New South Wales continues to progress, and even though the majority of cases are from that Northern Beaches area, there are absolutely exposure sites outside of that area. Those exposure sites are sometimes busy places. There is every reason to think that there might be cases now emerging outside of the Northern Beaches area. And so these new restrictions, these new red zones for the Greater Sydney area and the Central Coast are really in place on the expectation that there is every chance that people will crop up as cases in the Greater Sydney area. And so we do not want those individuals travelling to Victoria unless they're returning Victorians, and our safety net for those individuals are that they'll be in home quarantine, mandatory home quarantine on arrival in Victoria, that will know who they are, that will be checking on their home quarantine situation, and that they'll require a test during their quarantine period. These are proportionate measures because what we see today in Sydney is not what the situation will be like a week from now. We know that when there are exposure sites across many areas with many, potentially hundreds of exposed individuals, that there will be new cases cropping up over the next 14 days related to those exposure sites. Not everyone who goes to an exposure site is infectious, but there will be some people who've gone to these sites who've been infectious, who've been in close contact with others in an indoor setting, potentially for a protracted period of time, and that puts other Sydney-siders at risk. And so we need to take a precautionary approach and make sure that those individuals are not travelling to Victoria unless they're returning residents. And for the returning residents, we're really wrapping the quarantine system around them to make sure that if they do become cases, we'll know about them. They'll have very limited opportunity to transmit to anyone else in Victoria. We do have to hang on to this precious COVID-free situation in Victoria. And even though we haven't got community transmission that we've flagged now, Victoria really is, or should be, on high alert. Anyone who's got symptoms needs to present for testing. Nearly 10,000 tests yesterday, that's fantastic. But from this point onwards, anyone with symptoms, sore throat, runny nose, fever, headache, feeling unwell, you really must get tested and isolate until you get that test result back. Thank you. Jerome. There are always exceptional circumstances that we can consider, but it's going to be a very high bar. Those exemptions need to be approved by the New South Wales authorities, by the Chief Health Officer and her office in the first instance. But it's essentially for very strict, compassionate reasons. It wouldn't be out of convenience. It'll be on a case-by-case basis and in very limited circumstances, I would think.
So you'd most likely have to do 14 days hotel quarantine in Sydney and then come do the same thing?
Well, if you've completed your hotel quarantine, it really depends on what the circumstances are in Sydney at the point that you're released from quarantine.
Can I ask on the two extra people who got the virus in hotel quarantine, what the circumstances are they?
I don't know the demographic details for those individuals, but they're international travellers who've been tested and tested positive, but in hotel quarantine, no issues. Well, obviously we have to watch extremely closely what the epidemiology shows itself to be over coming days. It's not turned the corner yet, and I would expect more cases the way that it's grown in the last few days. So I wouldn't recommend people travelling into New South Wales. You don't know the circumstances that you might be caught in, whether it's in regional New South Wales or in Sydney. Obviously we're saying if you go to Sydney, you can't come back without putting yourself in mandatory hotel quarantine. You won't get a permit. For the rest of New South Wales, it's clearly low risk today, but we've seen Central Coast become a red zone from midnight tonight, and we've seen cases in Forster, north of Newcastle. So, this virus gets around, and there's every potential for other areas of rural New South Wales to be seeded. There's always that opportunity. Those compliance checks can happen, and if people are caught out, those fines and penalties will apply. If people can't demonstrate that they have given accurate information on their permit, then they're subject to potential penalties. You have to give an address that's verifiable on the permit, and if you're lying on that permit, then you're subject to those fines.
I think it was mentioned earlier that 3 of the people who were flying in from New South Wales had incorrectly said they hadn't been in the permit zones. How were they picked up?
So there were 2 unaccompanied minors who arrived in Melbourne. There was another individual who's a guardian. All 3 of them are in mandatory hotel quarantine because they were all from the Northern Beaches area. The guardian had been quarantining at home, but obviously went into hotel quarantine to look after those minors.
But there were 2 extra today, I think, from the red zone. Is that right, from that Northern Beaches area?
No, they're the individuals I've just referred to.
There has been any new...
No.
How worried are you by the fact that they haven't identified the original source yet? Does that matter by this stage, or is it kind of progressed?
It does matter in the sense that if you can't find that link, that chain of transmission to every single person back to the original international traveller in quarantine, then there are individuals who've been out there who've been potentially infectious, clearly infectious to have started this cluster in the first place, who might have infected other people who are yet to be found. That's a concern. The obvious other concern is that there are just a number of exposure sites where infectious people have been with a number of contacts, casual or close contacts, who might develop illness over coming days. That's another significant concern.
Is it a concern for you that there are no mandatory masks and safe home meetings?
I'm also not going to be commentating from the sidelines. You know, my position on masks is that it's a very small thing to require of people. It makes a difference. The science is in on masks. It reduces the risk of transmission. I'd recommend it in any circumstances where people can't physically distance appropriately.
Any other issues?